Welcome back to Crawford-Clark Close-Up's 007 retrospective as we inch closer to the 25th movie in the series, No Time to Die. After the warm reception afforded Timothy Dalton's Bond debut The Living Daylights in summer 1987, producers began almost immediately working on the 16th film, with a young Barbara Broccoli overseeing proceedings as associate producer and Michael G. Wilson largely taking over screenwriting duties due to the Writers' Guild strikes in 1988. An early treatment for Bond 16 was set in China, with focus on a warlord in the Golden Triangle mixed up in drugs. The treatment also wove in elements from Fleming's short The Hildebrand Rarity. Locations proposed included a fight amongst terracotta army figures and a motorcycle chase along the Great Wall of China, which, whilst sounding Bondian, would undoubtedly have created logistical problems. The plan to shoot in China was scrapped and a more balmy climb was favoured, Key West in Florida, with the team scouting locations in January 1988. Michael G. Wilson's 142-page screenplay entitled License Revoked, we'll get to that later, is delivered in May 1988 with two further revised screenplays in June and July. In an attempt to keep the film's budget down, as since Moonraker in '79 the budget for the films hadn't greatly changed, the crew moved out of Pinewood and set up shop in Mexico City. Wilson relates the license revoked narrative to Kurosawa's Yojimbo, with the samurai going into town and sowing the seeds of distrust and managing to get the villain to bring himself down. Filming began on July 18, 1988, running for 4 months, and under returning director John Glenn, principal photography began with Alvarez being dragged out of Lupe's bed by Sanchez's henchmen before we get Robert Davi's savage entrance to the film as Franz Sanchez. Stage 3 at Churubusco Studios saw Timothy Dalton filming at Leiter's house, Bond's hotel suite and the Barrelhead Bar over the following week. Glenn gets Dalton started with an anguished sequence as Bond discovers that Della Leiter has been murdered. Proclaims Dalton, "I wanted to make the movies much more realistic and believable. Over 25 years, these films and this character had gone off down lots of different avenues. There was a whole period when they became rather fantastical and gimmicky. The humour had become too exaggerated, too tongue-in-cheek. When you go back to the books, you're dealing with a real man, not a Superman, a man beset with moral confusions, apathies and uncertainties, one who is often very frightened, nervous and tense, and this is exemplified so well throughout the film as a whole." The immediately striking aspect of the film is 80s action composer Michael Kamen's dramatic score for Dalton's second gun barrel sequence. There's an urgency to the score that drives the film forward well before we open onto Bond travelling with Felix and Sharkey en route to Felix's wedding. Leiter is a familiar face as David Hedison reprises the role he took on in Live and Let Die 16 years earlier, and Dalton and Hedison's chemistry is fantastic. Frank McRae is also great as the put-upon Sharkey, whose job it is to tell Felix's bride-to-be Della that she'll have to go round the block a few more times as Felix is running late. Key West, Florida is the location for the pre-titles action this time around, as Bond and Felix thwart main villain Sanchez's plans to evade capture by the DEA. License actually marks the first time since The Man with a Golden Gun that our chief villain makes his entrance in the pre-title sequence, as the tradition, of course, is for the villain to get their big entrance later in the narrative, but Davi's menacing entrance as Sanchez is up there with the best, whipping his girlfriend for being unfaithful and ordering his henchmen to cut out the heart, off-screen, of her lover. I go back to Kerry Edwards' insightful analysis of Dalton's films, commenting on how this feels like the more everyman, relatable Bond 16th time around. License to Kill's opening stands out from the other Bonds. Yes, the stunt is spectacular and the action well filmed, but the context, a friend's wedding, is different. This Bond takes place in a world that could be ours. Bond is amongst friends, jammed into the back of the rolls, dressed in traditional morning suit. The action is quickly ramped up, however, as Dalton's Bond is once again right in on the action, performing the majority of his own stunts. The build of Kamen's orchestration of the Bond theme as Bond attaches himself to Sanchez's plane and winches him in is terrifically exciting and is further inspiration for director Christopher Nolan. Just look at the opening action of The Dark Knight Rises if you need the proof. The opening action with Dalton atop the helicopter before Bond and Felix parachute down to the front of the church to make their spectacular arrival was filmed in mid-August 1988 and caps another memorable pre-title sequence that's become a trademark of the Bond oeuvre. From here, we segue nicely from the congregation filing into the church into Maurice Binder's final contribution to the James Bond titles. Binder's designs over his 14 successive Bond adventures have ranged from evocative to slightly cheesy, and sadly his final contribution to the series falls into the latter category. There are a couple of nice nods to the narrative thrown in, but it's ultimately one of his weakest efforts. By contrast, Gladys Knight's storming title song fits the film well, with powerhouse vocals that could give Shirley Bassey a run for her money. Dalton's second outing as Bond plays far more to his strengths than Daylight's, and he takes to the action and the more sombre moments with aplomb. Licence borrows a great deal from Fleming's works and showcases a Bond that's as close to the literary protagonist as you can get, sneaking around, out for vengeance, infiltrating the villain's business, and holding a knife to Lupe, threatening to kill her if she makes a sound. To coin M's remark to Daniel Craig's Bond in Casino Royale, Dalton did it first in portraying the blunt instrument who will get the job done, whatever it takes. Bond is also a bastard in this film, flirting with Della on her wedding day, checking into the hotel in Isthmus City, and claiming the room is adequate before ordering Pam to change her image and buy some decent clothes. Carrie Edwards touches on Dalton's portrayal of Bond in this film particularly well, describing how Dalton builds on the rebelliousness shown in Daylight's to produce a performance unlike any of his predecessors. Here, Bond is given an emotional depth lacking in the previous films. On discovering Della and Leiter's bodies, he is visibly shaken. Previous films had existed in a largely black and white world, but there is ambiguity in the one Dalton's Bond inhabits. Dalton explained that his decision to take the role of Bond was due to Cubby informing him that they wanted the films to return to the spirit of Ian Fleming in his writing. In fact, Dalton and Robert Davi looked back to Fleming's novels and remarked at how Fleming describes the Bond and the villain as mirror images of each other. Bond just happens to work on the side of good, but his actions are often just as bad as the villain's. Fleming adds an extra level to Bond, however, imbibing him with very human characteristics, making him relatable and fallible. This Bond suffers to the point where he's bruised and bloodied by the end of the film, which we've never been shown in such an explicit manner until now. John Glenn's direction for Bond's solemn look at Della after she tries to toss him her garter is a perfect nod back to Bond's doomed marriage 20 years earlier in Majesty's, and a reminder to audiences that this is the same Bond who has suffered his own heartache and is unable to ever settle down. In my eyes, Dalton gives the strongest performance as Bond in this film up to this point in the series. To keep the film current, Michael Wilson writes a villain that's stripped straight out of the headlines. Robert Davi is perfect as Franz Sanchez, a man who rewards loyalty and who nonchalantly dismisses money. When Bond infiltrates Sanchez's business, Sanchez sees Bond as an ally, despite coming to learn that he is a former British agent. Bond earns Sanchez's respect, so it's all the more alarming for Sanchez to discover Bond's motivation all along when Bond makes him read the inscription on the lighter from Della and Felix before setting his foe alight. Sanchez is a fascinating, top-tier villain in the series. Benicio del Toro is also excellent in a very early role as Sanchez's right-hand man, Dario. His delivery of the line about giving Della a nice honeymoon to Felix as he's about to be fed to the shark is chilling and expertly played. The rest of the supporting villainous cast leave a little to be desired, except perhaps for Anthony Zerbe's Milton Crest, the name lifted from Fleming's Hildebrand Rarity, who falls to the wrath of Sanchez in the grisliest death sequence in any Bond film in the decompression chamber, which was undoubtedly one of the factors for raising the release certification for the film. The MI6 crew are used sparingly in this film, with Licence marking the last of Robert Brown's 4 appearances as M, getting crustier and more short-tempered with 007 with each film, to the point where Bond is summoned to M at Hemingway House in Key West to have his licence revoked. This is Robert Brown at his very best as M in the series, and the tension between Bond and his superior in this short sequence is well played. This will also be the last appearance for Caroline Bliss's Moneypenny, relegated back to the secretarial desk this time around and reprimanded for her typing errors in a report because she's worried about Bond, who has gone missing. The biggest MI6 presence in the film comes from Desmond Llewellyn's ever-reliable gadget master Q, who is on leave, and so joins Bond in the field in Isthmus, equipping Bond with all the necessary gadgetry for a man on holiday. Dalton and Llewellyn are brilliant together on screen, and it's a joy to see Q get the expanded role that he deserves. Whilst a lot is said about how bad Talisa Soto is in portraying Sanchez's mistress Lupe, both she and Carrie Lowell's Pam Bouvier acquit themselves very well to their respective roles and represent two of the most beautiful Bond girls up to this point. Where Lupe is underutilised, she does offer Bond a gateway into Sanchez's world. Pam Bouvier is a tough and resourceful CIA contact with information on Sanchez, who assists Bond throughout and gets stuck in with the action. Pam is one of the series' most self-sufficient Bond girls, and the scene on the boat between she and Bond after they've escaped from the Barrelhead bar is electric. For the character of Lupe, Robert Davi was asked by Cubby Broccoli to head the casting, as she is Sanchez's girlfriend, and they needed to find an actress who Sanchez would kill for. Both Cubby and Davi were sold on Talisa Soto. Licence to Kill is such an entertaining entry in the series, with a superb pace and a number of standout scenes that rank among the best of Bond. Taken straight out of the novel Live and Let Die, Lighter being fed to the shark provides the catalyst for Bond's revenge mission, and "he disagreed with something that ate him" is also a wonderful Fleming line from the same novel, utilised for the aftermath of the scene. Bond throwing the cash at treacherous Kilifer as Kilifer is eaten by the shark is another great moment for Bond. Dalton looking at Kilifer struggling to free himself from the shark with indifference is spot on. There's also some great action for Bond, with the water skiing behind the plane sequence in the second act being an entertaining set piece. We also get to see Dalton's 007 gambling in a casino again, complete with slightly questionable slicked back hair, a point which we won't labour, as it's been discussed more than enough by the Dalton detractors. There's some terrific locations utilised in Licence as well. Arabesque in Acapulco portrays Sanchez's villa with its pristine marble white walls and floor, and the Olympotech compound in the finale is also a suitably spectacular environment for third act Bond. The crew moved to Mexicali to film on particularly dangerous stretches of road for the thrilling tanker chase finale, with any filming mishap on the roads being blamed during production on the location's mysterious past. Said tanker chase and the downfall of Sanchez, with a bruised Bond surveying the scene in relief, represents one of the best Bond action finales. Bond's exhausted and gratified look as he watches his enemy burn is brilliantly played. Sanchez's death was filmed over 3 days, beginning October 5th, 1988. There are some aspects of Licence that don't sit well with the hardcore Bond fandom, and whilst I agree that Wayne Newton's inclusion as corrupt televangelist Professor Joe Butcher does seem at odds with the grittier tone of the rest of the film, it also serves as a bit of fun nonsense that adds some comic relief to proceedings, as does the winking fish as the end credits roll. This is Bond, after all, famous for its tongue-in-cheek amidst all the seriousness. Also, let's please put to bed this nonsense about Felix seemingly happy in hospital considering he's now widowed. I've never personally read this short sequence at the end of the film in such a way. Felix is lucky to be alive and is looking forward to spending some time with Bond when he gets out of hospital, but it doesn't mean that he's forgotten about his dead wife. Bond has also just presumably told him that Sanchez and his henchmen are all dead, so he has cause to feel a little gratitude towards Bond. Bond gets the right girl, and as the end credits roll, set to another ballad, this time Patti LaBelle's If You Asked Me To, we round out one of the most engaging, thought-provoking films in the series. With production complete, February 6, 1989 sees the first assembly of the finished film for the crew. 6 examiners from the BBFC see a preliminary edit of the film 2 weeks later, which begins 5 months of viewings, disputes, cuts and deliberations in order for the Bond team to reach the largest audience possible with their new film. The first issue was the film's title, Licence Revoked, which was vetoed for Licence to Kill, as it was felt that American audiences wouldn't understand the term revoked. The panel viewing the film demanded cuts be made to the violence to allow the film to pass as a 15. Without the cuts, the film would achieve an 18 certificate, significantly reducing the audience demographic. One examiner was perfectly content, however, to see a Bond movie rated 15 for a change. I was always concerned at the extra category in our calendar, the Bond PG, and feel the filmmaker's decision to make Bond considerably closer in style to the Fleming books has resolved what has always been a Bond anomaly. Moreover, Dalton himself has since remarked that the Bond movies were never made for children, and that the further out on a limb you go, the more exciting it is. The film was passed as a 15 in the UK, a PG-13 in America, after a number of viewings in July 1989, but Cubby found this particularly crushing, noting that Licence to Kill was so scrutinised for its violence, whilst the censors gave Tim Burton's Batman a clean bill of health, rating it 12 in the UK. Licence to Kill received its UK premiere on June 13th, 1989 at the Odeon, Leicester Square. Ultimately, with a poor marketing campaign and a saturated box office in the summer of 1989, with the likes of Batman, Lethal Weapon 2 and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, ironically featuring original Bond Sean Connery, the worldwide gross for Licence to Kill was $157 million, a drop on The Living Daylights, and the film failed to gain an American audience. Licence to Kill's total pales in comparison to the grosses of Batman, $411 million, and Lethal Weapon 2 at $227 million. The film, contrary to Sanchez's assurance to Leiter when feeding him to the shark, is anything but purely business. Licence to Kill works on many levels, not simply as an intriguing, intricately detailed and engrossing thriller, but almost as a standalone film, a rogue agent on a personal revenge mission against the man who murdered and mutilated his friends. In his second and, unfortunately, final appearance as 007, Dalton shines. He will never be like his predecessors, just as Moore never consciously tried to emulate Connery, but with James Bond in the noughties, Daniel Craig certainly has a lot to thank Timothy Dalton for. Both give very human portrayals of Fleming's characters who show emotion, pain, anger, frustration, loss through their detailed, meticulously crafted personifications of Bond. You can imagine Dalton having to ruthlessly kill if the situation demanded it, which you would never get from Roger Moore's interpretation of the role. Had the box office not been populated by Batman, Lethal Weapon and Indiana Jones, incidentally all focusing on heroic protagonists, Bond 16 would have achieved bigger business on general release in the summer of 1989. Regardless of this, the film is one of the best of the later Bond films, and arguably the best Bond of the 1980s. It holds up brilliantly after 30 years, and marks a great film in the series for director John Glenn to take his bow. How many times can one man leave you breathless? Asks the trailer voiceover man. I've lost count. To end this review of one of the very best Bonds, I return to Kerry Edwards and his astute summary of Dalton's tenure, as well as the end of the classic Bond before its 6-year hiatus. Edwards posits that the film offers closure to the original series of films, a Bond who no longer needs M or Her Majesty's government, who has come to terms with his wife's death and can fall in love with a woman who is as strong as he is, one who doesn't need rescuing. And yet, the ever-reliable words James Bond will return are there in bold at the end of the credits, reassuring fans that even though we'll have a bit of a wait, Bond will be back in the new decade to thrill us all once again. If, like me, you were quick to dismiss Licence to Kill as a vacuous Miami Vice-style generic 80s action film, it's about time to reassess one of the most underrated of all the Bond gems. Bless your hearts. From Crawford-Clark Close-Up. So, where does Licence to Kill sit for you in the Bond canon? Are you a lover or a hater of Dalton's time as 007? Let us know your thoughts on the film and our review in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this review, please subscribe at the top of the page. Come and find Crawford-Clark Close-Up on Facebook and Twitter, and drop us an email with suggestions for future reviews on the channel to crawfordclarkcloseup@gmail.com. James Bond will return as, to round out the Dalton era, we're bringing you our greatest Dalton Bond moments in the next video. Look out for that shortly. Thanks for watching, and until next time, that's a wrap.